به انگلیسی میگم بهتره. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Tim Bailey, who has graciously accepted to speak tonight. After a couple of trials, we were able to arrange for tonight. So Tim is a colleague of mine at the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, which is one of the largest unions, labor unions in the United States. We have about 1.4 million members in the US and Canada. And I work in the safety and health department. I'm an occupational health and safety specialist, and I've been there for 18 years. But Tim is the director of Global Strategies Office in the Strategic Research and Campaigns Department of the Teamsters Union since October 2005. In that position, he oversees the Teamster relationships with a broad range of international unions and allies. Priority focus is on relations with unions representing workers in multinational companies who employ current or future Teamster members. He was an organizer and service representative from 1980 to 1990 and has staffed global strategies in the labor movement at Public Services International and the AFL-CIO prior to coming to the Teamsters. Tim will speak about, the topic is labor unions as a building block of democracy. And he will also talk a little bit about the relations between the international labor movement and the Iranian labor movement as well. Thank you, everyone. Tim? Oh, yes.
Good evening. So maybe you can tell me a little bit more about you so that I can make my comments more responsive to your interest. Is anybody here a member of a trade union? Now, what trade union are you a member of?
Right now, I work in the library and I'm a member of Fairfax County.
So you're a member of the Fairfax County,
Union.
okay, public sector, right? Do you know the national union that you're affiliated to?
No.
Okay. Anybody else a member? So she's a librarian for Fairfax County, and the librarians in Fairfax County are represented by a union. Anybody else a member of a union? Okay, here's a ringer. This is my wife. Her name is Liz Beatty. And Liz, what union are you a member of?
The NEA.
And because what kind of work do you do?
Public school teacher.
So Liz is a public school teacher, and she's a member of the Fairfax County Education Association, which is part of the Virginia Education Association, which nationally is part of the National Education Association, the NEA. Anybody else a member of a union?
I am the member of the Fairfax Art League.
A member of the Fairfax Art League. What does the Fairfax Art League do?
They're a group of the artists. They have art exhibition every month.
We are a member of the Fairfax Art League. We are a group of maybe 85 members from this league. And we have the art exhibition every month.
So you're all artists, and you joined together because together you have an exhibition. And it's hard to do alone, but when 8 of you are together, then you can have people from the public come and see all of your art together.
That's right.
So that's
And
kind
this
of like
Friday,
a,
also, this Friday we have also art exhibition in Sherwood Community Center in
Okay.
Fairfax.
Can I come?
Sure. Yeah, I get.
Is anybody else a member of the union, of a union here in the United States? Okay, here's a question. Was anybody a member of a union when you lived in Iran? You were a member of a union, okay, could you describe that? What union did you be a part of in Iran?
I was a member of two unions.
Steel workers.
One name was a speak worker, Smith,
Steel worker.
Smith, a steel worker.
Uh-huh.
And I was Mitglied in Fabric Arch, Union Fabric Arch.
It was a fact.
کارخونه Arch.
Okay. And tell me about this union in Iran. Was it a union that, what did the union do in Iran?
Excuse me, I cannot speak good
به
English.
فارسی دیگه من ترجمه میکنم.
عرض کنم حضور شما که در زمان شاه یونیون ها اساساً در دست سازمان امنیت در رأسش بود. بگید تو که من بگم براتون.
The unions in Iran at the time of the Shah were under the control of the security agency of Savak, I believe.
After revolution, you have too many different unions, got different name. سندیکا بود، شورا بود، اتحادیه ها بود و بحثی بود که بین شورا بهتره یا سندیکاها که اساساً جمهوری اسلامی سندیکاها رو رد کرد، اتحادیه ها رو رد کرد و فقط شوراهای به اصطلاح نه کارگری بلکه شوراهای کارمندان یعنی کارگر و کارمند و رئیس کارخونه حتی عضوش می بودن.
After the revolution, the Islamic Republic, there was a proliferation of worker groups, and they were divided into syndicates, labor unions, and also councils. And this council, the Islamic Republic did away with the syndicate and labor union part and kept the councils, but there were mixed group of employers, sometimes the management and workers and the professionals, they were all mixed.
ولی این شوراها هرگز مورد توافق و قبول اکثریت کارگران ایران نبود.
But this was not accepted by the majority of the workers.
در ظرف چندین سال گذشته کارگران ایران در اشکال مختلف مبارزات صنفی و اقتصادی خودشون رو پیش بردن تا در ظرف 10-12 سال گذشته موفق شدن که 4 سندیکا در ایران به طور غیر قانونی به وجود بیارن ولی همشون فعالیت علنی میکنند. ناماشون هست سندیکای کارگران شرکت واحد تهران و حومه، سندیکای کارگران نیشکر هفت تپه، سندیکای کارگران نقاش حومه سنندج و یکیش هم به اصطلاح سندیکای کارگران نقاش تهران است. این 4 تا سندیکا الان وجود دارن و اساساً هم در جهت به اصطلاح بسط و گسترش سندیکاها تو کارخونه‌های دیگه هستن. یعنی چندین ارگان هم ما وجود داریم که فعالیت میکنن برای خاطر ایجاد تشکل‌های کارگری در کارخونه‌های مختلف.
In the past 10-12 years, there have been, the workers have stepped up their efforts to create, labor movement, and there are 4 syndicates or labor unions that are illegal, but they're still functioning openly. And one is the Transport Workers Union that we are familiar with because we've done some work with them. And the second is the sugarcane workers. And the third and the fourth are painters of Sanandaj and Tehran. They're 2 different cities. So these 4 represent the main units. But
Painters like artists or painters like painting walls?
نقاشای هنرمند یا نقاشای
ساختمانی
No, building painters, yeah. construction trades, yeah. And they're continuing, and they're trying to, there are organizations that are trying to expand on these activities.
So what, before the revolution, when you were working in this factory and you were a member of a union, what did the union do? What did it do for you? Did it do anything for you?
از کنم حضور شما سندیکاها اساساً در زمان رژیم گذشته فقط مدافع منافع اقتصادی کارگران بودن، یعنی از منافع اقتصادی مثل اضافه دستمزد، مثل داشتن بیمه اجتماعی، مثل اصطلاح گرفتن اضافه کار به حق، چون اضافه کاری‌های زیادی می‌کردن و دریافت حقوق نمی‌کردن و بیمه درمانی و سندیکاها اساساً در این چارچوب منافع اقتصادی کارگران کار می‌کردن.
Under the Shah's regime, the unions were protecting workers' economic interests only, and so there were, issues like wages and health insurance and overtime and social insurance. That's all.
So the union helped you get a better living standard? Yeah, okay. Was anybody else a member of a union in Iran before you came over to the U.S.? Okay, so many of you are not in the union in the U.S., many of you were not in the union in Iran, so many of you have never been a member of a union. Those of you that have not been in a union, do you have any idea what a union is? Or should I explain that a little bit more?
No, I don't.
You don't know what a union is? Okay, what's your job? What do you do?
I'm a physician.
You're a physician. Are you a member of the American Medical Association?
I am.
Okay, that's a little bit like a union. A little bit like a
Oh,
union.
union that I see.
A little bit like, not, it's a professional association. It's not quite the same thing, but it's a lot like a union.
Would you define the union?
Say again?
How you define union?
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to define it for everybody that doesn't. So, what other kinds of jobs do people have? What's your job, sir? You that introduced me today. What's your job?
I do construction.
You're in construction. And, okay, you with doing the BlackBerry or the Facebook back there, what's your job? What do you do?
I'm a realtor.
You're a realtor. Do realtors have an association of realtors?
Yes, we do. And I'm a member.
And you're a member. You're not a member.
I am
I'm a member. How much do you pay to be a member?
580.
There are so many.
She writes the checks, right?
From my country.
$600 a year. Okay. Good. What other kinds of jobs do people have? What's your job, sir? What do you do?
Retired faculty member.
So you're a teacher.
Right.
So there's also teachers organizations in Iran as well. How about you, sir? What do you do? What's your job? Say it again?
engineer.
You're an engineer. Okay, and there's many engineering groups of, what kind of engineering do you do?
Radio frequency. I work for Sprint.
You work for Sprint. Okay, great, okay. So, I want to talk about essentially three things. Okay, I want to talk about why workers form unions, and then a little bit about how unions work here in the United States, and then a little bit about the organizations that unions have created globally and how they're linked to Iran. Okay. Second thing I want to talk about is about the conditions for workers in Iran as they are reported to us in the international labor movement by small independent workers organizations in Iran. And the reports that they tell us are that things are not good for workers in Iran. And then the third thing that I'd like to talk about, and this is the part where the title for the talk comes, I'd like to talk about some experiences of workers in unions in other countries that helped contribute to building democracies in those countries. Okay, so those are the three things that I'd like to talk about. Is that okay? And I understand that there's plenty of time for questions, so if you have something else that you'd like to talk about, there'll be time for questions and answers after we take a break. Okay with everybody? What's your job, sir? What do you do?
I used to be around, but I'm not a member of the union. I used to be a member of American Association of University Professors.
Okay, university professor. And you, sir, what's your job?
Used to be health physicist.
Used-
Health physicist.
Health physicist.
What is a health physicist?
Radiation protection.
Radiation protection.
Oh, okay. So you're a healthcare professional.
Pretty much like IH you are.
Okay.
It's quite fashion. Radiation.
Okay, so at the workplace, wherever you work, people sometimes form unions because they get frustrated with the management, with the supervision, with the ownership, with the people that run the institution that you work in, whether it's public, run by a government, or private, run by the owners of the company. People get frustrated because they're not getting paid enough money, they don't have good health care benefits, they don't have a decent pension, they don't like the hours that they work, they're afraid the place they work is unsafe, they're afraid for their health, they're afraid of what's going to happen to them. Mostly people join unions because they're frustrated and they feel a lack of a sense of dignity. Because I think it's all of us as humans, part of being human, part of what makes us who we are, part of what we're about, part of being a human being that feels dignity has to do with the kind of work we do. Has to do with the way that we give back to society through our work, but also that work provides a sense of dignity, including pay, including salary, that allows us to provide for ourselves and for our family, for our lifestyle. And the experience for many workers when they go individually to the boss, to the owner, and they say, I'm not feeling dignity here. I'm not feeling respect. I don't feel that you pay me enough money, or I don't feel that you treat me well. I feel like you speak to me in a way that I shouldn't be spoken to. I feel like I'm being discriminated against. Whatever the feeling is, if one person goes to the boss and says, I feel like you're not treating me with respect, sometimes the experience of that worker is that the boss says, fine, go work someplace else. And the workers says, well, it's not that I don't like my job. It's not like that I don't like what I'm doing. I chose to do this job because I think it's a way for me to express my humanity, to express my contribution to society. And really, I'm not sure it's your choice, boss, to tell me whether this job is good for me or not. I simply want you to treat me with respect when I'm doing the job. Can you identify with this feeling? Does this sound like something that you may have experienced? Maybe?
Yeah.
You have? Yes? You say yes?
During the time that airport workers were on strike, Reagan used terms like that.
Yes, true. The air traffic controllers, yes?
You can go and read Reagan's code, and those codes, give you some description.
Yes. So this goes back a ways, but in 1980, the first year that Ronald Reagan was the President of the United States, a group of air traffic controllers who already had formed a union went on strike, and they thought Ronald Reagan would help them because Ronald Reagan himself used to be the president of a union. Ronald Reagan was the president of the Screen Actors Guild when he was an actor. But instead of working to find a solution to their problem, he fired them all. So anyway, if I go as just one person and I go to the boss and I say, I want you to treat me with more respect, and the boss says, go find someplace else to work. And I said, that's not an appropriate response. I still feel my humanity because of the contribution I make through my work. What choice do I have? Well, that's right. Many people say, how can I make my voice more powerful? I want this to be a good place to work. I want to make a contribution, but I feel frustrated with the way I'm treated. So maybe if I join together with the other people at the same place where I work, and that we grow as a group to the boss, and we say as a group, as all the workers, we want you to treat us better. We demand that you treat us better. Then the boss, it's not so easy for the boss to say, go find someplace else to work, because if he tells everybody to go find someplace else to work, then he doesn't have any workers, right? So this idea of people joining together to have a conversation with the boss about better treatment or better pay, something to do with what's happened, or health and safety, whatever that may be that people are concerned about. People join together and they form a union. They form an organization of workers whose purpose is dignity at the workplace. Okay, that's the definition of a union. Now, that's a little bit different from a professional association, because doctors work at many workplaces, right? I work at my office, I work at my clinic, maybe I work at 1 or 2 or 3 different hospitals, or maybe I go give advice in somebody else's clinic. I work at different places, but doctors all join together in the US and form the American Medical Association because they want to defend the standards for doctors. They say doctors ought to be paid a certain amount of money, and they say, you know, doctors need to meet certain standards to do a good job. Right? Doctors are worried about malpractice insurance, so we have to keep malpractice insurance now. Oh,
They don't do that one. They don't do that one.
So,
but continuous medical education, continuous medical education.
Being a better professional, being a better doctor. Also, when the artists here in Fairfax County, when they get together, they're getting together because they find benefit in being a group rather than being individuals, so they come together. Not a union, but kind of like a professional association, artists that get together to help each other, mutual support. Right? So people that get together for mutual support, when they work in one workplace, they're forming a union. And historically, bosses don't like the idea of workers forming a union. They want to get rid of the union. They don't want anybody to form a union because they don't want workers to be able to demand higher wages, better benefits, because that means those owners have less profits. Less money for me, more money for the workers, right? So employers don't like this idea. And historically, starting especially after the Industrial Revolution, starting in the 1840s, 50s in England, and then spreading across the world, in the Industrial Revolution, workers more and more tried to form unions because employers tried to repress and oppress workers more and more inside the context of the Industrial Revolution, where everything was about lowering the costs as much as possible. And so, as industrialization spread around the world, including to Iran, workers more and more formed trade unions. When workers formed trade unions in Europe in the 1870s and 1880s, they began to understand, because, as you know, in Europe there's a number of small countries. If I form a union in Belgium, but the workers in France don't form a union, then my boss, he'll move to France because they don't have a union there, right? Or if I form a union in Sweden and the workers in Norway don't have a union, then we've got a problem because one group of workers is organized and knows how to defend themselves, but the employer then just goes someplace else. And then what happened is workers in Europe began to see that the employers started talking to each other across countries. And so the workers started talking to each other. And what happened in Europe was that workers in France, for example, were feeling repressed, and sometimes they even had to leave the country. They had to go into exile. Some of you, I think, maybe are in exile here in the United States. They had to go into exile to escape from bosses that were after them. And so unions began to communicate between countries in Europe. And they began to form international organizations of workers, of unions. And those organizations, some of them still exist today. And those were the international labor movement. So inside the United States, there's about 60 different national unions. And there's a number of smaller unions around the country, representing altogether about 13 million workers in the United States are members of unions. That's about 12% of workers in the United States are members of trade unions. And those unions, including the Teamsters, our union, we represent about 1.4 million members in the United States. We form national organizations. One of those national organizations is called the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organizations. That's a big national organization with offices here in Washington. It's existed since about 1957.
Does not include physician.
Some physicians have unions. So if I'm a physician and I work in one hospital, and all the physicians in the one hospital get together, some of those physicians join a union for negotiating with the employer at that hospital. But most doctors work at a number of different places, and they don't tend to join a union. What they do tend to do is join the American Medical Association. Yeah. Okay. So inside the United States, then, there's individual unions that represent groups of workers. So if I work, for example, I was talking about Liz. So Liz works at Union Mill Elementary School here in Fairfax County. And the teachers for all of Fairfax County, they have one union called the Fairfax Education Association, FEA. Is that right? Yeah. And then the Fairfax Education Association, they link together with the other teachers' unions in Virginia, and they have formed the Virginia Education Association. And the purpose of the Virginia Education Association particularly is to lobby the state government to make sure that education is funded well, including teacher salaries. And then the Virginia Education Association, together with the associations in the other 50 states, they've formed a national organization called the National Education Association, the NEA. And the National Education Association fights for teachers' rights in the national government, among other things. And then the National Education Association participates in an umbrella organization of all the unions in the United States called the AFL-CIO. Okay. There are similar structures like that for transportation workers, for beer workers, for soft drink workers, for bakery workers, for milk workers, for healthcare workers, for retail workers. If you go to a Giant food store, all the workers that work in Giant, all the cashiers, they're all a member of the United Food and Commercial Workers. And the truck drivers that deliver all the stuff to the Giant store, they're all members of the Teamsters. And the warehouse workers. Do you get any packages delivered by UPS? Everybody that works for UPS, all the guys that wear the brown uniforms, guys and gals that wear the brown uniforms, they're all members of the Teamsters. So 13 million workers, lots of workers in the United States are members of different unions. They belong to different organizations. There's national umbrella organizations that they belong to defend rights at different levels. Okay? And then we have a set of organizations, the labor movement does, that organize workers globally And those organizations, there's a small group of them. So the umbrella organization for all the workers in the United States, the AFL-CIO, is part of a global structure called the International Trade Union Confederation, the ITUC. If anybody wants like web pages or that kinds of thing, I can give them to folks afterwards. And then there's a series of structures that group together unions by sector of the economy. So there's something called the International Transport Workers Federation that groups together all of the transport unions around the world. There's an International Union of Food Workers that groups together all the food worker unions around the world. There's an international organization of teachers called Education International. There's an international organization for all the industrial workers of the world. So, back about 5 years ago, a staff person from the International Transport Workers Federation, based in London, that the Teamsters belong to, called me, because I'm the Global Strategies Director for the Teamsters. I'm in charge of our international relationships, and told me that there was repression of a union in Iran called the Vahed. Huh?
Yes.
The bus drivers union for the Tehran area. And they told me that a man named Mansour Osanlu had been put in jail for organizing the union. And in fact, he organized some strikes. He organized some work stoppages, trying to get better wages and better conditions, more respect on the job. And so now you see how these structures work. So we form an international structure. It means that transportation workers around the world can talk to each other through this International Transport Workers Federation. And we try and help each other's interests globally wherever we can. So through the International Transport Workers Federation, we found out that there was a problem for transport workers in Iran. They informed all the other unions of transport workers around the world, including the Teamsters. And they asked us all to go to our Iranian embassy in each of our countries and present a letter saying Mansour Osanlu should not be in Evin prison. Mansour Osanlu should be back at his job with his colleagues driving a bus because he didn't do anything wrong. All he did was do what workers do all over the world, which is to come together as a group for dignity at the workplace. And we didn't understand why the Iranian government thought that there was something illegal or something inappropriate or something revolutionary with the idea that workers at a workplace should be able to join together for their common interests and talk to the boss as a group rather than as an individual. That didn't make any sense to us, so that's what we did. And we've continued to do that with other workers. The sugarcane workers that were mentioned by the colleague in the back. So the sugarcane workers are another union that's been repressed. People have been put in jail. Teachers have been put in jail. Journalists have been put in jail. So this is sort of the way that unions are formed at the workplace. And when we have a conversation with the boss, we want to make sure that the boss says, yes, I'll give you a raise, not just today, but for a longer period of time. In order to make sure that he's committed to paying us a good wage for a longer period of time, we have them sign a contract. And when we talk about a contract between a worker and the employer, what we talk about is a collective bargaining agreement. So collective, all the workers together, bargaining with the employer, we reach a particular kind of an agreement, a contract that we call a collective bargaining agreement. So 13 million union members in the United States are all covered by a collective bargaining agreement. Well, mostly. Sometimes in the public sector, even though the teachers have a union, they don't have a collective bargaining agreement, right, Liz? Okay, so that's kind of mostly what I wanted to say about unions and the global labor movement and how it functions. And I'm saying that for those of you that don't know much about what a union is, not that much different from a professional association, but it's about workers getting together at a workplace. And when workers get together at a workplace and demand their interests at the workplace, then they find that they want to group together with other workers that do the same kind of job, especially those that work at the same employer. So if I work at a Coca-Cola bottling plant, I'm interested to know what the Coca-Cola workers at the other bottling plants around the United States. So there's about 60,000 Coca-Cola workers around the United States. About 20,000 are members of the Teamsters. They work at a number of different bottling plants, around the United States. But they have a union. They belong to the Teamsters. And they're interested to know what's happening with workers that do the same job for the same company, but in other parts of the United States. And in the same way, Coca-Cola workers in the United States want to know what's it like for Coca-Cola workers in Iran, or Coca-Cola workers in Brazil, or Coca-Cola workers in Germany, or Coca-Cola workers in Japan. So we have an international organization of food workers, including Coca-Cola workers. And this organization lets us communicate with each other, find out what's going on. We even get together every once in a while. Coca-Cola workers do, all around the world. We have meetings every once in a while. And sometimes in those meetings, we even go to the headquarters of Coca-Cola, which is in Atlanta. It's a US-based multinational corporation. And we talk to the company at its headquarters about problems with workers in all kinds of different parts of the world where problems might be going on. So a Coca-Cola worker in Colombia was killed not that long ago. And so we talked to the company about making sure that they end the violence against workers in Colombia, for an example. So workers, local experience, national experience, global structures to help us communicate with each other, including workers in Iran, talking to workers in other parts of the world about what's going on in Iran. Any questions about that part?
How you communicate with them?
So we have this structure based in London called the International Transport Workers Federation. And this structure has a secretariat, maybe 30, 35 people. And they're from different countries, they speak different languages. And it's their job to be in communication, to know what are all the unions around the world that work in the same sector we do, keep in contact with them, email, letters, however they do it, telephone. And then they write up the information and send us newsletters and other kinds of information so we know what's going on in other parts of the world. And every once in a while we have a meeting where we all get together and talk to each other directly, face to face.
The government, how you deal with the government? I mean,
Ooh, yes, how do you deal with the government in a place like Iran? Yeah, we're going to talk about that. Yeah, I'll get to that one. Okay. So, that leads into the next section. Go ahead, you had a question?
Yeah, do you have any meetings with the workers in Iran? Have you had any direct meetings with union workers or the workers in Iran?
Yeah. So, it's rare. Most of those meetings are with workers in exile. But for example, the same guy that I was talking about, Osanlu, from the Vahed, from the bus drivers union, he was out of jail for a period of time. And we sent him a ticket, and he came to London to a meeting that we had, and I got to meet him, and many other people from transport workers around the world got to meet him. So sometimes we get to meet people from Iran, yes. Okay, yep.
It's going to be interactive conversation, or you protect your...
So if you have
answer that.
questions to clarify what I'm saying, go ahead and ask the question. But there will be a question and answer period afterwards. So if you got like a little question, something you want clarity about, bigger questions, there's a question and answer period after we take the coffee break. as I understood it.
Yes.
Did I understood it standing correctly? Yes. Okay. Okay. So, second thing that I want to talk about is the situation for workers in Iran today. And the information, I've never been to Iran, the information I get is from a couple of organizations that the global labor movement is in contact with. One is the Committee for the Defense of the Iranian People's Rights, CODIR. I got a report from them. And I got a very recent report from the Association Defenders of Workers' Rights in Iran. And I have names, people that I've been in contact with, that kind of stuff. So the reports that we get, I already mentioned the case of Osanlu, is that the current Iranian government, the revolutionary government, does not tolerate the organization of unions, independent unions, in Iran. And when people go through this exercise of trying to group together and to demand dignity, to demand rights, to demand better wages, to demand better conditions, to demand a safer workplace, what happens is they get fired in general. And if for some reason they can't be fired, they get put in jail sometimes. And so that was the experience with Osanlu. He spent a lot of time in jail, and other members of that union. It's the case of the sugarcane workers that you mentioned. They've had some of their leadership put in jail. There's teachers that have tried to unite, that have been put in jail. And then there's journalists, sometimes grouping together, but sometimes simply reporting on the conditions of workers in Iran that are getting put in jail for reporting on difficult conditions. That's what we're telling, and I've got a whole bunch of names of folks here that are serving sentences for labor activities, and others that are waiting a court decision that are probably going to be put in jail as well. So this is a situation that has been reported on. We've got the names of folks. I've met Mansour Osanlu myself, for example, know that he spent a good deal of time in Evin prison. Evin prison? Evin prison. No. So one situation is that some leaders, some workers that lead other workers to try and demand justice at the workplace are being fired and are being put in jail for standing up for dignity at the workplace. Now, another major feature of the situation in Iran is that the government in the last few years has adopted a monetarist policy, national economic policy. A little bit like what the Republicans want to apply here in the United States versus what the Democrats want to do. A policy that tends to be sort of make the government small, help rich people get richer, because big money knows best how to run the economy. So we're told that that's the general economic thinking, which means that in general, what we've seen as far as economic policy in Iran over the last decade or so is let's privatize, let's sell stuff off from government and put it into private or these kind of non-profit organizations that they have, sometimes religious associated organizations that they have in Iran. The financial sector is getting bigger in Iran. They're ending subsidies. So subsidies for electricity, subsidies for gasoline, all the kind of many subsidies in which the government helped keep prices lower for working people have been lifted. No more subsidies. Prices have risen for a lot of basic goods. in Iran? There's an elimination of national planning. So again, this idea the government doesn't do anything well, therefore get the government out of all kinds of planning, let the market and let other forces in the economy figure stuff out. That's the thinking. The International Monetary Fund, which is a Washington-based organization that's supposed to look out for economies all over the world, they think that the Iranian government has done a pretty good job. They are monetarists. They are from the perspective that less government, more private sector is always better in general. Sometimes this is called the Washington Consensus, for those of you that are economists out there and think about this. Now, these policies, what they always do when they're applied all over the world, is that they create more inequality. They create a group of very wealthy folks, and they create a bigger group of not so wealthy, poor folks in the United States. That's in whatever economy it's applied, including in the United States over the last 20 years. So, wealth concentrated in the hands of fewer, more folks at the bottom end of the economic scale, and a shrinking middle class. That's what's happening here in the United States, and that's what's happening in Iran as well, under this set of policies.
That's fine.
Okay. So, inequality is deepening. There is something called the Labor Act, and there is something called wage control committees at a number of workplaces in Iran, but these are what they call tripartite bodies. They're made up of management, government, and labor. But oftentimes the labor representative is not a union at all, but somebody that's often controlled by management. So the structures set up under Iranian law now that are supposed to be established to improve the standards for workers through a tripartite body, through people working together, labor, management, and government, is not working well because there's not an independent voice for workers. And I think you alluded to this when you were talking about what's happened since the revolution. And all small businesses are even exempted from those minimal standards. So anybody with 10 employees or less, no standards. Huge problem in Iran these days with unpaid wages. People go to work, they work all day, they work all week, they work all month, no pay. Zero. They just don't get paid. And if you complain about not getting paid, you get fired.
This happened over here for 2 weeks. 2 weeks over here, they didn't pay.
Yeah, government shutdown. Nobody got paid, that's right. I'm not saying it's any better here. I was criticizing the U.S. too. Maybe it's a little bit better here.
I have a good question for you.
Big problem with gender discrimination in Iran. Many times women doing the same job as men get paid as much as 66% less than men get for doing the same kind of work in Iran. Huge problem with discrimination.
Here also in the United States.
Happens here in the United States as well. You're going to disagree with me?
Is that Mr. Barahini? Yes, Mr. Barahini? Welcome.
Are we going question and answer?
No, just small question. No, go ahead. Yeah, you can sit if you don't.
Louder, please.
You want to hear?
Well, I try to scream. I think that reading, one of the things that appealed to me when I came here was that this was
So I thought that I was learning a great deal about what is happening in Putin, what we were doing in the nation too, particularly the contemporary culture of the country. My name is Barahini, and I'm a writer and a poet, and
also a university professor, has been a university professor in
Can
Iran.
hear.
And so I think that somehow the idea that there was in Iran a Writers' Association of Iran, and there still is a Writers' Association of Iran, which was created during the Shah's time, not of course because of the Shah, but in fact against his policies. And it dealt, of course, with the same kind of organization which you have here in the States, PEN, the International PEN, and it was actually under the charter of the International PEN that the Writers' Association was created, and almost all the great writers of the country gathered together and created that organization. It was after the revolution somehow, the present Islamic Republic was against it, but we gathered together again and created the Writers' Association, and it is perhaps one of the most important organizations. And of course, many of the members of the Writers' Association have been in prison, and even 2 or 3 of them actually have been killed by the Iranian government. So it's a very difficult situation, to work under repression in many of these countries. And of course, both the Shah's government and the Islamic government have been repressive governments. And in fact, the only policy which would be common for those two, some kind of community of policies actually, is that they are both repressive. And they are both against the intellectuals. They're both against the idea of the concept of freedom of writing, freedom of publication. And in many cases, of course, many writers, including several friends of mine, have actually been killed under very mysterious situations. And of course, everyone knows that it was actually the Iranian government that killed them. So, and the reason some of the Iranian writers actually left the country and tried to stay away from these murders was that those people were killed. When I see, something like Kanun-e-Dostar in Iran, the Cultural Association, the Iranian Cultural Association in Washington, I thought that everything was going to be somehow relevant to, at least to a certain degree, the situation in Iran and the writers of Iran and the repressive policies of the present government, which is actually an adaptation of the repressive policies of the Shah's government. Because in those days also, most of these writers went into prison. So I thought how some of these things could be relevant to your organization. So I thought that I should mention this. I'm sorry that I talked too much.
Thank you. I think that's consistent with what I'm reporting. Just a couple of more points from what we're hearing about labor conditions in Iran. I talked about gender discrimination. There's also reports of ethnic discrimination. For example, Afghanis working in the United States, working in Iran, making almost no money, almost in sort of semi-slavery kinds of conditions, and child labor. So the reports from the International Labor Organization is that Iran has one of the highest levels of child labor of anywhere in the world. So these are the reports that we're hearing from workers' organizations in Iran. It's not a pretty picture. Last point of my presentation, we'll take a break, part about democracy. So what I want to talk about are some examples from some other countries, Brazil and South Africa, Egypt, Thailand, Chile, Tunisia, about countries in recent history, in our lifetimes, where labor, organized labor, trade unions, have made a significant contribution to the building of democracy in those countries. Yeah. So, in the Arab Spring, last couple of years, maybe not so much in the press, and not in every country that was touched by the Arab Spring, but in Egypt and in Tunisia, organized workers in unions made a huge contribution to the changes that took place in those countries. The UGTT in Tunisia, for example, continues to be among the very most important civil society organizations in that country, with the processes of change going on in that country. In Egypt, there was a formal labor movement controlled by the government, but a series of activities by independent workers' organizations, particularly a number of strikes over the last 7 or 8 years, that have helped create an independent organization of workers whose movement began with simply trying to create more dignity on the job, but came to understand, these workers, that there needed to be a change in government if they were ever going to achieve their aspirations. Were important contributors to changes going on in those countries in the last couple of years. In Brazil, dictatorship in the 1960s and 70s, organizations of workers, particularly metal workers, particularly in the automobile and industrial areas outside of Sao Paulo, forming trade unions with multinational companies who allowed a little bit more respect for the rights of workers to form trade unions in Brazil, led to a workers' movement that led to not only the overthrow of the military dictatorship that had run that country, but eventually to the fact that one of those original union leaders, one of those organizers in the metal factories outside of Sao Paulo, decided to form a workers' party, and Ignacio Lula da Silva becomes president of Brazil, moving right out of the labor movement. His experience representing workers, organizing them, negotiating collective bargaining agreements, building linkages with other workers also working in the metal sector in and around Sao Paulo in Brazil, eventually leads to the conclusion that they're doing good work to create dignity for workers at the workplace, but in order to finish the job, they've got to create a political party to have dignity for workers all around Brazil. They decide to do that. They form the Workers' Party, and the Workers' Party eventually wins a national election, and Lula becomes president of the country for 2 terms, and he's still the most popular politician in all of Brazil. Lula is his name. In South Africa, the apartheid government in South Africa, a white minority running the country of South Africa, also in this case, metal workers, but also in the mines of South Africa, often owned by multinational corporations, begin to form trade unions, first to defend dignity for themselves at the workplace, but then begin to link their struggle to the struggle against apartheid and for freedom for blacks in South Africa. And the trade unions form a national organization, now today called COSATU, which allies itself with the South African Communist Party and with the African National Congress, and you know the Nelson Mandela story. They overthrow the apartheid regime, and that coalition has been the political leadership in South Africa for the last 4 terms now in government. A couple of other stories about the way that these international structures operate. Yeah, I'm almost done. So, less known stories in Thailand. If you read the news today, there's a guy named Thaksin Shinawatra, who's, I guess it's the daughter or the niece, is currently the president in Thailand. But this is one of the richest guys in Thailand. He achieves the presidency part by spreading around his money. Trade unions in Thailand understand and begin to critique what's going on in their country. But there's repression against workers being able to meet together to talk about dignity at the job and what's going on outside the workplace. But one of the places where they're allowed to meet is when trade union organizations internationally come in to do workshops. And so this international labor movement that I described previously, including an organization I used to work for, would regularly organize seminars around Thailand that the government decided, because they were foreigners coming in, they wanted to appear to be respecting democracy, let these seminars take place. And these seminars were one of the places where ideas could be fomented and people could talk to each other about how to begin to build structures like trade unions to defend both dignity at the workplace and dignity in politics. And they were involved with changes in the government there in Thailand. In Chile, under the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, unions were also completely repressed. But in the public sector, I was part of an international structure of public sector unions. Again, the military dictatorship allowed us to come in and hold meetings. But more importantly, what workers in the public sector did was they knew that their employers would always report back to the government if they ever got together to talk about straight trade union work, to talk about wages and benefits and dignity at jobs. So what they did was they began to form study circles, and they would get together to talk about the latest book, to talk about politics. Study circles to talk about all kinds of issues that seemed innocent. And so they were not repressed. The government let these kinds of meetings happen. And inside groups of government workers all around Chile during the dictatorship, workers began to organize, first by holding meetings that were just innocent meetings about, let's get together and talk about the book we read, or let's get together and talk about some other discussion that didn't have to do with politics or with things at the workplace. But these relationships, these meetings, these forums where people began to be able to get together and talk to each other, also began to be the places that began the seeds of workers beginning to organize to defend themselves and change what was going on against the dictatorship in Chile. And so again, the labor movement, fundamental in first the no vote against the continuation of the dictatorship, and then the votes for succeeding new governments since the end of the dictatorship for democratic governments in Chile. So labor movements, sometimes known, sometimes not so well known, have often played an important role in defending democracies and building democracies in countries all around the world, including during the Arab Spring. So those are the three things that I wanted to talk about. You want to answer things?
Question and answer. Question and answer. What's that? What is
So Azita asks, how does the experience in a union relate to how democracy works? So maybe Brazil is the best example. So Lula, a poor guy from a northern part of Brazil that migrates down to the southern parts of Brazil, starts working in a factory and starting talking to his colleagues and says, if I go and ask the boss alone, I'm not going to get anywhere. This union experience that I was talking about before. But if we go together, if we form a union and go together and talk to the boss, then maybe he's going to have to treat us with respect, which is exactly what happened at that workplace. And that experience for Lula of uniting workers together, of gaining their trust, of discovering the power that exists when people get together and work as a group and form strategies and plan alliances, and then Lula going out and talking to other workers in other plants, was the basis of his experience, because it's a political experience as well, that led him to be the kind of leader that began to understand the power of workers and the workers' movement, and then the power of forming a political organization, a party, workers' party in this case in Brazil. So that kind of experience at the workplace can be an experience that's a building block for democracy because of the nature of what it takes to form a trade union and the kind of trust that has to be built, and the process of not only education about work, but education about politics that happens when people form trade unions.
Thank you so much, Tim. So.